I never expected to find a half-starved, shivering alien girl crouched in the alley behind my shop. The rain had been coming down hard that evening, washing the streets of New Terra in a cold, relentless downpour. I had just locked up for the night, stepping out into the wet, miserable world beyond my workshop when I saw movement near the garbage bins. My first thought was that it was another street rat, some desperate thief hoping to snatch scraps. The outskirts of the colony weren't exactly paradise, and with work being scarce and food scarcer, scavengers were common. I kept a heavy wrench, strapped to my belt just in case. But when I got closer, I realized this wasn't just some human vagrant. She was tall and impossibly thin, her body wrapped in tattered, soaked rags that might have once been a dress. Her skin, smooth and an unnatural shade of deep twilight blue, glowed faintly under the dim neon signs flickering above us. Her silver-white hair was plastered to her face, matted with dirt, tangled beyond repair. And then there were her eyes. Golden, luminous, but not with health or vitality. They were sunken, tired, full of something I couldn't quite place, something between despair and surrender. I stopped a few steps away. My instincts told me to leave. She wasn't my problem. She must have heard me approaching because she looked up suddenly, those strange eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, she didn't speak. She just stared at me, lips slightly parted, as if she had forgotten how to use words. I had seen that look before, the look of someone who had been beaten down by life so many times that they'd stopped expecting kindness. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she moved. She crawled forward and lowered herself until her forehead touched the wet, filthy ground before me. "Please!" Her voice was soft, barely audible over the rain. "I beg you, let me serve you." I stiffened. What the hell was this? Elirans, her kind, had once ruled the stars. Their empire had been vast, spanning hundreds of systems, their fleets patrolling the void with arrogance and power. They had looked down on humans, treating us like little more than ambitious vermin, clawing at the edges of their dominion. And now one of them was kneeling in the mud, begging for scraps. "Who are you?" My voice came out harsher than I intended. "And why the hell would I take you in?" Her shoulders trembled. She lifted her head just enough for me to see her face, rainwater running down her cheeks like tears. "I am Liara." She swallowed hard. "And I have nowhere else to go." I clenched my jaw, my fists tightening at my sides. I had been a child when the war ended, when humanity had finally overthrown its old oppressors and carved a place for itself among the stars. We had fought, we had bled, and we had won. For a long time, I had imagined what it would feel like to see an alien brought low. It didn't feel good. It felt wrong. I sighed and ran a hand through my rain-soaked hair. "Get up," I muttered. She didn't move. I said, "Get up," I repeated, firmer this time. "I'm not talking to you while you've got your face in the damn mud." Slowly, hesitantly, she pushed herself upright. But even then, she didn't fully stand. She stayed on her knees, hands resting on her thighs, her back straight despite the obvious exhaustion weighing on her. The old alien pride still lingered somewhere inside her, but it was buried beneath layers of desperation. I glanced around. We were alone, the alley dark and empty, except for the dim glow of neon advertisements flickering overhead. If I left her here, she'd be dead within a day, either from exposure, hunger, or someone less merciful than me. "All right," I muttered. "You can come inside, but no funny business, got it?" She nodded quickly, like a prisoner receiving a last-minute pardon. I turned on my heel and headed back toward the workshop, barely hearing her quiet footsteps trailing behind me. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I should have walked away. I should have left her in that alley, let fate take its course, and gone to bed without a second thought. That was the logical thing to do, the human thing to do. We had fought too hard, struggled too long to finally earn our place in the galaxy. We had no reason to pity the Elirans, no reason to offer them a hand when they had never done the same for us. But logic had nothing to do with it. She followed me into my shop, stepping hesitantly through the doorway, as if she expected the warmth inside to vanish the moment she crossed the threshold. I shut the door behind her and turned the lock, more out of habit than anything else. The cold, metallic scent of rain still clung to both of us, mixing with the familiar aroma of oil, grease, and old machinery that filled my workshop. She stood there, dripping water onto the floor, her hands clasped together as if afraid to move. Her golden eyes flicked around the room, taking in the cluttered workbenches, the half-assembled machines, the rusted tools, and the faint glow of a heating unit in the corner. This place was nothing compared to the opulent palaces her kind had once lived in, yet she looked at it as if it were something sacred. "Sit," I said, pulling out an old metal chair. She obeyed immediately, lowering herself onto the seat with careful, deliberate movements. The way she carried herself was strange, graceful yet hesitant, like someone who had once been used to command but had long since forgotten what it meant to hold power. I grabbed a clean towel from a nearby shelf and tossed it to her. "Dry yourself. Off." She flinched slightly at the sudden movement, but caught it, gripping the fabric tightly in her hands before pressing it against her face. As she dried her hair, I rummaged through my storage locker and pulled out an old set of clothes, nothing fancy, just a spare shirt and a pair of worn-out cargo pants that I had long since outgrown. They wouldn't fit her well, but they were. Better than the soaked rags she was wearing now. I held them out. "Here, put these on." She stared at them for a long moment before finally reaching out to take them. Her fingers brushed against mine, and I noticed how cold they were, colder than they should have been. Alirans were supposed to be stronger than humans, their bodies designed for endurance, their immune systems far superior, but this one, she was fragile, weak. I turned away, giving her some privacy as she changed. It took longer than I expected, and when I finally glanced back, I saw her standing awkwardly in the oversized clothing, the sleeves of the shirt hanging past her hands, the pants barely staying up on her thin frame. The sight was almost comical, but there was nothing funny about the way she held herself, rigid, uncertain, as if waiting for some unseen punishment to fall upon her. "You hungry?" I asked. She blinked, clearly surprised by the question. Then, as if remembering herself, she quickly nodded. I moved to the small kitchenette in the corner and grabbed a can of protein rations. Not exactly gourmet, but it was edible. I heated it up and placed the bowl in front of her. "Eat." She hesitated only for a moment before picking up the spoon and taking a bite. The reaction was immediate. Her hands trembled, her lips parted slightly as if she couldn't quite believe what she was tasting. It wasn't good food, not by a long shot, but judging by the way she devoured it, it might as well have been a feast. "You been starving?" I asked, watching her closely. She swallowed hard before nodding. "I have not eaten in 2 days." I frowned. 2 days wasn't enough to make someone this weak. "And before that?" She hesitated, lowering her gaze. "Scraps. Whatever I could find. Elirans weren't meant to live like this. They were supposed to be the superior race, the rulers of the stars. But this one, she was barely surviving. As she finished the last of the food, she set the bowl down carefully, folding her hands in her lap. Then, to my surprise, she lowered her head again. "Thank you," I exhaled, rubbing the back of my neck. "You don't need to keep doing that." She lifted her head slightly. "Doing what?" "Kneeling, bowing, acting like I'm some kind of master." Her golden eyes met mine, filled with something I couldn't quite name. "You saved me. I owe you." I sighed, leaning back against the counter. "I didn't save you out of kindness. I did it because leaving you out there would have kept me up at night. You work for your keep, that's all. No debts, no servitude." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe me. For her, this wasn't just survival. This was something deeper, something personal. And I had no idea what to do about it. It took weeks before Liara spoke more than a few words at a time. At first, she was silent, moving like a shadow through my workshop, cleaning with an almost religious devotion. She scrubbed, polished, and arranged my tools with a precision that was almost unsettling. I didn't ask her to do it. She just did. The first morning after I took her in, I woke to the sound of something clattering in the kitchen. I grabbed the wrench from under my cot, instincts kicking in before I realized what was happening. But when I stumbled in, half awake and ready for a fight, I found Liara standing at the sink scrubbing dishes. She turned at the sound of my footsteps, her golden eyes wide with something close to fear. Not fear of me, fear that I would stop her. "You don't have to do that," I said, lowering the wrench. She bowed her head slightly, turning back to the water. "It is my duty." I frowned. "No, it's not." She hesitated for a moment before speaking again, her voice quiet. "I must repay what I owe." I didn't have the energy to argue that early in the morning, so I let her be, but it didn't stop there. She cleaned everything. The kitchen, the floor, the workbenches. She even organized my tool racks, arranging them in a way that somehow made more sense than the system I had been using for years. When I told her to take a break, she only bowed her head and continued working. At first, I let it slide. Maybe it was her way of coping. Maybe she needed to feel useful. But as the days passed, something about it started to bother me. She wasn't just working hard, she was working like her life depended on it. One evening, after a long day fixing up a client's hoverbike, I found her outside in the workshop's courtyard, scrubbing the pavement with a rag and a bucket of water. She was on her hands and knees, her silver hair falling over her face, her movements methodical and desperate. I stepped forward. "Liara." She froze. Slowly, she sat back on her heels and turned to look at me. "Yes." I crossed my arms. "Why are you doing this?" She blinked. "Doing what?" I gestured around. "All of this. The cleaning, the organizing." "You don't owe me anything." She lowered her gaze. "I must serve." "Why?" For a moment she didn't answer. She just stared at the ground, her fingers tightening around the rag in her hands. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "Ailerons are taught to be perfect," she said quietly. "Even those of noble blood. We are trained to fight, to negotiate, to lead, but also to serve." I frowned. "That doesn't make any sense. Your people were conquerors. You ruled over others." She nodded slightly. "Yes, but we were also taught that power is fragile, that the higher we rise, the further we can fall. It is why even nobles were trained in menial tasks, so that if we ever lost everything, we could still serve." I didn't know what to say to that. She looked up at me then, her golden eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. "I fell," she whispered, "and now I must serve." I let out a slow breath, rubbing my temples. "Liara, you don't have to live like this. You don't have to act like some kind of slave." She flinched slightly at the word. I sighed, kneeling in front of her so that we were at eye level. "You want to work? Fine. But do it because you want to, not because you think you have to." She stared at me for a long moment. Then slowly, she lowered her head again. "I understand," she said softly, but I wasn't sure she did. Liara didn't stop working, but something changed after that night. She still cleaned. She still organized my tools with that unnerving precision. But she moved differently now, less frantic, less desperate. She no longer flinched when I walked past her or stiffened whenever I addressed her directly. She started eating more too, though I noticed she always waited for me to eat first, as if expecting permission. It was progress, I supposed. I wasn't used to sharing my space with anyone. The workshop had been mine and mine alone for years. The quiet had been something I'd grown comfortable with, even enjoyed. But now there was always this presence, silent but constant, a reminder that I was no longer alone. I caught her watching me sometimes, not in a fearful way, not anymore. It was more like curiosity, like she was trying to figure me out, trying to understand the man who had taken her in despite everything. One night, as I worked on an old, rusted generator, I felt her eyes on me again. "You need something?" I asked without looking up. There was a pause. Then, hesitantly, she spoke. "May I ask a question?" I tightened a bolt before setting my wrench down. "Go ahead." "Why did you save me?" I let out a slow breath, wiping the grease from my hands with an old rag. I'd asked myself the same question more times than I could count. I didn't have a satisfying answer. "You were going to die," I said simply. She tilted her head. "Many have died. You would not have been blamed for leaving me." I leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. "Maybe not, but that doesn't mean I'd feel good about it." Her golden eyes searched my face, as if trying to find some deeper meaning in my words. "Humans are strange." I let out a dry chuckle. "You're one to talk." She looked down at her hands, fingers tracing the fabric of the old shirt she still wore. "In the old days, if a human had found one of my kind alone and helpless, they would not have been so merciful." I stiffened, slightly, but didn't deny it. She wasn't wrong. "I fought in the war," I said finally. "Not on the front lines, but I was there. I saw what your people did to us, and I saw what we did to them when the tide turned." She nodded slowly. "Then why spare me?" I exhaled. "Because I was tired," she blinked. "Tired? Tired of all of it," I muttered. "Tired of war, of hate, of looking at someone and only seeing an enemy." I glanced at her then, meeting her gaze. "I'm not saying I've forgiven your people for what they did. I don't think I ever will. But I'm also not interested in punishing someone who had nothing to do with it." She was silent for a long time. Then slowly she nodded. "See," she murmured. I thought that was the end of it, but after a moment she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was supposed to die." I frowned. "What?" She kept her gaze lowered, her hands clenched in her lap. "After the fall of our empire, there was an expectation that those of noble blood would not live in disgrace, that we would take our own lives rather than become burdens." A cold feeling settled in my gut. "You mean—" She nodded. "I was the last of my house. My name, my bloodline, everything that made me Aileron was gone. There was no place for me in the new world, no purpose." I swallowed. "But you didn't know." She looked up then, her golden eyes unreadable. "I ran. I didn't know what to say to that." She turned her gaze to the dim light flickering above us. "I thought perhaps if I could find someone willing to give me a place, I would not have to die, that I could belong to something, even if only as a servant." Her words made something tighten in my chest. I didn't like the way she said them, like she still believed she had no value beyond what she could offer to someone else. I pushed myself off the workbench and grabbed a wrench. "You want to belong," I said, tossing it onto the table in front of her. She blinked at it. "What? You're not a servant," I said firmly, "but if you want a purpose, you can work with me." I gestured around the workshop. "Learn, fix things, earn your place the way the rest of us do." She hesitated, staring at the wrench like it was some foreign object. "I don't know how," she admitted. I smirked. "Then I guess it's time." "You learned." For the first time since I'd found her, something close to a real expression crossed her face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. Liara took to learning faster than I expected. She was hesitant at first, as if waiting for me to change my mind. But the moment I placed a tool in her hands and showed her how to use it, something shifted. Her fingers, once delicate and suited for the finery of a life long lost, adapted quickly to the rough work of repairing machines. She watched me closely, golden eyes tracking every movement as I demonstrated how to loosen a corroded bolt, how to test a circuit, how to tell the difference between an engine that could be salvaged and one that was better left for scrap. She never asked me to repeat myself. When I corrected her, she nodded and tried again without complaint. She was determined. At first, she worked in silence, but after a few days, the question started. Why do humans design power cores this way? Would it not be more efficient to reroute the cooling system here instead? Why do you use these materials instead of something stronger? I had to remind myself that she wasn't just some fallen noble. She was Aileran, the same race that had built ships capable of crossing the void faster than light, that had engineered weapons capable of wiping out entire human fleets before we finally turned the war in our favor. Her people had been conquerors, yes, but they had also been builders, innovators, and she was smart, too smart. More than once, I caught her adjusting my repairs when she thought I wasn't looking. At first, I thought she was making mistakes, until I realized that her adjustments actually improved the efficiency of the machines. You could have just told me, I muttered one evening after noticing she had subtly rewired the cooling system of a hoverbike engine I had been working on. She looked up from her workbench, hands still gripping a welding tool. Would you have listened? I opened my mouth, then closed it. She had a point. For all our progress, I still wasn't sure how to fully trust her. The war had been over for years, but old habits died hard. Ailerans had spent generations treating humans as nothing more than laborers, soldiers, or subjects, and we had spent just as long fighting to prove we were more than that. I wanted to believe she had left all that behind, but there was still a part of me that wondered. One night, as we locked up the shop, I decided to test something. "You ever worked with weapons?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. She stiffened slightly but didn't look at me. "Yes." I leaned against the doorframe. "What kind?" Her grip tightened on the rag she had been using to clean a spanner. Aileran nobles are trained in many disciplines. Combat was one of them. I studied her. "You any good?" She finally looked up at me, her expression unreadable. "Good enough to survive." That wasn't the answer I was expecting. "Ever killed anyone?" I asked. She hesitated, just for a second. Then quietly she said, "Not in battle." I felt something cold settle in my gut. "What does that mean?" She met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw something dangerous lurking beneath the surface. Not a threat, not hostility, but something deeper, a weight she carried that I hadn't seen before. "It means," she said softly, "that survival sometimes demands difficult choices." I exhaled slowly. "You still believe that?" She looked down at the rag in her hands. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know that I do not wish to be that person anymore." For some reason, I believed her. I didn't know what kind of past she had left behind or what kind of things she had done to make it this far. But she was here now, working, learning, trying. Maybe that was enough, for now. The days turned into weeks, and Liara became part of my routine. She woke early, usually before me, and by the time I stumbled out of bed, the shop was already organized. She had an uncanny way of knowing exactly what work needed to be done before I even said a word. If a machine was left disassembled the night before, she had all the necessary tools laid out before I could ask for them. If a delivery was expected, she had already prepared the storage space. She worked with quiet focus, never complaining, never asking for anything. But she was changing. The noble stiffness she once carried, the constant bowing of her head, the hesitation in her movements, all of it was slowly fading. She stood taller now, her golden eyes sharper, her hands steadier. She wasn't just trying to survive anymore. She was learning, and I had to admit she was good. One afternoon, I handed her a broken power converter and told her to take a crack at fixing it. She sat at the workbench, examining the damaged circuits with a look of intense concentration. I busied myself with another job, expecting to hear her ask a question or call me over to check her progress. She didn't. Instead, I heard the sharp snap of a soldering iron, the faint hum of reconnected circuits, and finally, a soft click as the device powered on. I turned, raising an eyebrow. "You got it working?" She nodded, placing the converter on the table. It was a simple misalignment in the power relay. I picked it up, testing it. It ran smoother than before. I let out a low whistle. "Not bad." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something. Then, after a pause, she asked, "Does this mean I am useful?" I frowned. "You don't have to prove your usefulness to me." She hesitated. "But it is better if I am." I sighed, setting the converter down. "You're not here because I need another worker. You don't have to keep earning your place." She looked away, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I don't know how to exist without purpose," she admitted. I studied her for a moment. She wasn't lying. For all her intelligence, all her skill, there was still something broken inside her. She had been raised to believe that her worth was tied to her role, first as an Illyrian noble, then as a discarded remnant of a fallen empire. Now she was trying to shape herself into something new, but she didn't know how. I grabbed a wrench and tossed it to her. She caught it reflexively. "Then here's your purpose," I said. "You're my apprentice now." She blinked. "Apprentice," I smirked. "Yeah. You're already better at this than half the idiots I used to work with. Might as well make it official." She stared at me, processing the words. Then slowly, something changed in her expression. It wasn't quite a smile, but there was something lighter in her eyes, something almost like relief. "I will do my best," she said. I grinned. "I know." She turned back to the workbench, and for the first time since she arrived, she looked comfortable. Not as a servant, not as a broken remnant of a lost people, but as someone with a future. The first time Liara laughed, it caught me off guard. It was a small thing, a brief, breathy sound, as she watched me struggle to fit a rusted engine module into place. I had been cursing under my breath, gritting my teeth as the damn thing refused to lock in properly, and when I looked up I saw her covering her mouth, her golden eyes shimmering with something unfamiliar. Amusement. I stared at her. "Did you just laugh?" She immediately stiffened, her hand dropping to her lap. I apologize. I did not mean—" I raised a hand. No, I'm just surprised. I didn't know you were capable of that." She blinked, tilting her head. "Capable?" I shrugged, wiping sweat from my forehead. "I've never seen you smile, let alone laugh." She hesitated, her expression unreadable. Ellyrans are taught to control their emotions, to be composed, especially in the presence of those beneath them. I smirked. "Well, you're not above me anymore, so feel free to laugh at my misery all you want." Her lips parted slightly as if considering my words. Then after a pause she said, "I would not laugh at your misery." I scoffed. "You just did." She lowered her gaze, but I caught the way the corners of her mouth twitched. It wasn't much, but it was something. She was changing. It wasn't just the way she carried herself, though that had changed too. She no longer moved like a shadow, afraid to take up space. She stood taller, spoke more freely. She no longer waited for permission to sit at the table or hesitated before eating. She was beginning to belong. One evening, after a long day of repairs, we sat outside the shop, watching the twin moons rise over the scrapyard. The air was cool, and the faint hum of distant machinery filled the silence between us. Liara sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the sky. I glanced at her, noticing the way the silver glow of the moons made her features seem softer. She was beautiful, not just in the way Ellyrans were always beautiful, elegant, otherworldly, but in a way that was real. She was no longer some untouchable remnant of a dying empire. She was here, living, breathing, rebuilding herself, piece by piece. "You ever think about leaving?" I asked suddenly. She turned to me, her brow furrowing. "Leaving?" "Yeah," I said, leaning back against the wall. "You could. There's nothing keeping you here. You could start fresh somewhere else, a new name, a new life." She was silent for a long time. Then softly she said, "Would you want me to leave?" I exhaled through my nose. "That's not what I meant." She studied me, her gaze searching. "I have spent so long trying to be what others expected me to be," she murmured. "A noble, a servant, a survivor. But here, I am learning to simply be." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized what she was saying. She wasn't just staying because she had nowhere else to go. She was staying because she wanted to. I smirked, nudging her arm. "Well, if you're gonna stick around, I expect you to pull your weight." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Of course." The silence stretched between us again, but this time it was comfortable. She turned her gaze back to the sky, and I sat beside her, the warmth of her presence no longer something foreign. She was still an alien, still the last remnant of a fallen empire. But she was also Liara, and for the first time, maybe that was enough.